Okay, so this is your first skill builder. I usually do this in written form, but since we're doing the COVID version, we've decided that we're going to film the skill builders, and they will be independently placed on our website. So anytime you have to do, say, a half square triangle and you've forgotten how to do it, you can just go find that video for that skill builder. So this is the half square triangle skill builder. What is a half square triangle? Well, it's when you have a square and it's stitched down the diagonal and you have one fabric on the top and one fabric on the bottom, which you're going to see here in just a second. The first thing I want to talk to you about is the formula. With all things quilting, we usually have to calculate, well, if I want my block in my quilt to be 3 inches when it's finished, meaning it's sewn all the way around, what size square do I start with to get a half square triangle that finishes at 3 inches? So once you know the formula, it becomes super easy. You can calculate it yourself, and you can do this method for any quilt, no matter whether the instructions tell you to or not. So the actual formula for a half square triangle is you take your finished size. Now the finished size is the size that it is when it's sewn on all 4 sides. It doesn't have, the seam allowance is already taken up. So that's the size it is in the quilt. And you add 7/8 of an inch, which I have right here. And that's the size you're supposed to cut your square. So if you wanted a finished 3-inch half square triangle, you would cut that at 3 7/8 inches, and when you got done sewing and you pressed, it should measure 3 7/8 inch. Okay, so that's the actual formula. I don't like that formula. I like my formula. Okay, when you sew on a diagonal and you press against it, you're pressing on what's called the bias, which is the seam that, the stretchiest part of the fabric. So it's pretty often that when you press and you sew on that, you're going to get some distortion. Well, if you cut it at 3 7/8 and you sew that, it's supposed to be the perfect size. So if there's any distortion at all, you don't get to trim it at all. So my recommendation is you take your finished size and add 1 inch. Now that math is really easy. It's really easy to cut 1 inch and not 7/8. So it would be finished size 3, add 1 inch. So you would start with a 4-inch square. Then after you got done sewing, you're going to trim that. And remember that a finished 3 before it's sewn in will measure 3.5. And it gives us a chance to trim that to 3.5, making all 4 sides perfectly square. And that's the formula I recommend we do. Okay? So today I'm going to demonstrate that on an actual 3-inch square. I'm going to toss this over there. So I've got a 3-inch square here. Excuse me, I have a 4-inch square. So I started with 3, added 1 inch. So I've got a 4-inch square. I'm going to take this, and if you want to zoom in here, I'm going to take a ruler, and I am going to place that ruler so that it intersects both points on the diagonal. Now I've got a Sharpie, which I wouldn't normally use, but I want you to be able to see this line. And so I'm going to offset it just a tad to absorb the thickness of my point, and I'm going to draw this just like this. Okay? So you have a line drawn on one diagonal. That's what we mean when we say draw a line on one diagonal. Now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch on each side of that line. And she's going to catch up with the camera here. I'm using a 57-foot, which has a guide, which makes it easy. I'm just going to place that guide right on the line. And I'm going to sew down one side of that line. And then I'm going to pick up and I'm going to come over and I'm going to sew down the other side of that line. Now, I'm going to come back over here. Now I have both sides, a stitched line, a 1/4 inch on both sides of that line. Okay? I'm now going to take my ruler and I'm going to place it on that line I drew on the diagonal, and I'm going to cut this in half, which gives me 2 halves. Okay? Pretty cool. Now, I forgot to bring my pressing surface over, so I'm going to finger press this, but you're going to open this up, and I always like to open so that the seam presses to the dark side, so that would be the purple, and I'm going to finger press this. I prefer pressing with an iron, but we'll survive this today, okay, with a finger press. But can you see when I do that how stretchy that is? So you can imagine if you're pressing with your iron how easy it would be to stretch that out, okay? And you get 2 of these. Look, 2 for the price of 1. So now you've gotten 2 with those 2 little seams, right? Now remember, we added 1 inch, not 7/8, so I have to then adjust this to measure. This should now measure 3.5. So if the finished size is 3, I add 1 inch, which gets me to 4. After I sew it and open it up, it should measure 3.5. You're going to need a bias square ruler, okay? So a bias square ruler is a square that has the diagonal. Because the most important thing you should know when trimming this is that that diagonal needs to stay on that seam. And you can use, as long as the square is bigger than the finished size that you need, you can use everything from the exact, like I could use a 3.5, this happens to be a 4.5. I could even use something as big as this because it has all the marks for the different squares. I prefer, my recommendation for $5 quilt is always the 6.5 inch one because it really gets you most of the sizes you will need for the program. So I'm going to lay this down, and you zoom in, I'm looking for 3.5. So on my ruler right here, this is the 3.5. I'm going to place the diagonal line on that seam, and I'm looking for the 3.5 inch line. Now, your thought would be, well, put it right out here on the outside and trim the 2 sides. But if I want this to be perfect, I want to trim all 4 sides. So I'm going to slide this up in just a little bit so that my 3.5 is just up inside and I still have fabric here, and I'm going to keep the diagonal right there. And I don't normally cut while I'm sitting down, but I'm going to do that, making sure that's right. I'm going to cut this side, and notice I sweep that away, and I'm going to cut this side, and I sweep that away, okay? Now, I've got 2 sides trimmed. I'm going to turn it around, and now I'm going to take that 3.5 inch line. Sorry. So I'm looking 3.5, and I'm looking, now I'm going to put the 3.5 on the outside, making sure this is still on the seam, and now I can trim this side. Okay. And I have a perfectly trimmed 3.5 inch half square triangle. And you're going to do this for however many that you need. Now notice what I trimmed off. I call this a smidge. You only added 1/8 of an inch. You should not be trimming more than 1/8 of an inch off. If you are, something's wrong, okay? So this is now ready to go into my block. And it's perfectly square, and it's the right size, and I love it. Anytime I can add something to a block a little bit and then trim it off to make the block perfect is where I want to be. And that's how we recommend doing half square triangles. All right. Just quickly, I want to show you one other thing since we're doing a skill builder. There is something called a block lock ruler. Block lock rulers have a little groove in them. And one of the advantages of a block lock ruler, go ahead and again finger press that seam, is that, I always want to do that upside down, is that when you slide this in, that little groove catches on the seam. So you don't have to worry about it slipping and sliding while you do this. And if you use the exact size, this one happens to be the exact size, 3.5, you can actually slide it up, and when you've got it so that there's fabric all the way around, and I have to do this standing up, you can actually cut all 4 sides at once, which makes you a little bit of a pretzel. You can get also, there's the Brooklyn Revolver, or one of the cutting mats that turns, and I can tool all 4 sides, and because that groove hugs that seam, I've got that trimmed, and I've done all 4 sides at once. And so the block locks come in the sizes for all your different half square triangles. You can use bigger ones than you need, but you would do the same thing that I just did with the other ruler. You'd do 2 sides and then you'd flip over and do the other 2 sides. So lots of good choices, but for sure in this program, you will need a bias square ruler. So you're either going to need one like this. You can get block locks, but you're going to need a ruler that's got the groove all the way on the diagonal. Not a groove, or a line. All right, that's it.